My name is Elara Vance, and exactly 72 hours before I was supposed to pledge my life to another human being, my own father told me I wasn't worth the walk. It was a Tuesday afternoon. In the world of high-stakes weddings, Tuesdays are for the finishing touches. I was in my studio, the air thick with the scent of damp moss and sheared eucalyptus. My hands were deep in the guts of a floral installation, soil staining the cuticles of my fingers, a lo-fi playlist humming in the background to keep my heart rate steady. Then, the phone lit up on the mahogany workbench. The caller ID didn't say, Dad. It said, Arthur Vance. I had changed it months ago, a subconscious preparation for a rejection I think I always knew was coming. I couldn't use my hands, they were slick with water and plant sap. So I swiped the screen with my elbow and put it on speaker. Elara? His voice wasn't shaking. That was the part that stayed with me. It was the voice he used for closing insurance claims or telling a solicitor he wasn't interested. It was a voice made of dry paper and clinical distance. I'm here, Arthur. I'm just finishing the centerpieces. Are you and Mom still coming up for the rehearsal on Thursday? There was a pause. It lasted 5 seconds, but in the silence of a drafting studio, 5 seconds feels like an eternity. You start to hear the clock on the wall. You start to hear your own breathing. I'm not walking you down the aisle, he said. 6 words. That was the budget he had for my heart. I didn't drop the shears I was holding. I set them down with a terrifying, surgical precision. I wiped my palms on my jeans, staring at a map of a botanical garden I had spent 3 months designing, feeling the world tilt on its axis. Excuse me? I asked, my voice coming out as a flat, dead thing. Julianne says it would upset her, he continued, his tone shifting into that weary, long-suffering cadence he reserved for my sister's emergencies. She's going through a very difficult time, Elara. The separation with her husband, the children. She says seeing me give you away, seeing you start a new life while hers is in pieces, it would be too much. She needs to feel like our family is a unit right now. She needs me by her side in the pew. I didn't cry. I think I had run out of tears for Julianne somewhere around the age of 19. This is my wedding, Arthur. Not a therapy session for Julianne's divorce. Don't be dramatic, he snapped, the first sign of emotion breaking through his professional veneer. It's just a walk. Lots of modern women walk alone. Your mother agrees. She'll call you in a few minutes to discuss the logistics. Just, try to be the bigger person for once. The line went dead. 10 minutes later, exactly as predicted, my mother called. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I needed help. She spoke like she was reading from a corporate brochure for a crisis management firm. She told me to focus on the empowerment of walking solo. She told me not to make a scene that would embarrass the family. But as I stood there in the quiet of my studio, looking at the 200 chairs I had rented for a family that was currently dissolving into the shadows, I realized something. For 24 years, I had been the one building the greenhouse, while Julianne was the one burning it down for warmth. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to fix the hinges. I was going to let the whole thing collapse. To understand why a father would trade his daughter's wedding day for his other daughter's comfort, you have to understand the ecosystem of the Vance family. We grew up in a house of white clapboard and manicured hedges in a town where the size of your lawn determined the weight of your opinion. Julianne was the sun. I was the moon, only visible when the sun decided to go down. My sister is 3 years older than me, and from the moment she could speak, she dictated the atmospheric pressure of our home. She was the one with the straight A's, the debate team trophies, and the future that was mapped out in gold ink. My father didn't just love her, he worshipped the idea of her. At neighborhood parties, he wouldn't introduce us as his daughters. He would lead with, "This is Julianne, our future litigator," and then, as an afterthought, gesture to the kid with dirt on her knees and say, "And this is Elara. She likes the outdoors." I was the scapegoat. Not because I was bad, but because I was inconvenient. I was the one who came home with torn leggings because I'd been climbing the old oak tree to see how the bark changed at the top. I was the one who spent my allowance on heirloom seeds and pH strips while Julianne spent hers on sweaters that matched my mother's. I remember the summer I turned 15. It was the year I built the greenhouse. I'd scavenged the wood from a demolition site 3 blocks away, dragging the beams home one by one. I used plastic sheeting from the hardware store and hinges I'd salvaged from an old kitchen remodel. It was 7 feet tall, slightly crooked, and my mother called it an eyesore that was ruining the property value. My father never even stepped inside it. But that August, while the rest of the neighborhood's gardens were wilting under a heat wave, my greenhouse produced tomatoes the size of my fist. Deep, dark purple heirlooms that tasted like summer and victory. The Regional Youth Agricultural Fair fell on the same Saturday as Julianne's regional spelling bee. I had spent months documenting the growth, the soil nitrogen levels, the light cycles. I had a growth journal with daily photos. I wanted my father to see that I had built something from nothing. I wanted him to see that my outdoorsy hobby was actually a craft. He promised he'd be there for the awards. The fair ended at 4 p.m. I stood by my display, a blue ribbon pinned to my poster board, watching the crowds thin out. I watched the judges stack the folding chairs. I watched the sun dip low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the gymnasium floor. He walked in at 4:45 p.m. "Sorry, kiddo," he said, not even looking at the ribbon. He was checking his BlackBerry. Julianne's event ran long. There was a dispute over a word in the final round. We had to stay for the appeal. You know how competitive these things are. "I won first place, Arthur," I said, my voice small. "That's great." "Good job," he replied, the same way you'd compliment a stranger's dog for sitting on command. "Come on, your mother has a dinner reservation at the club to celebrate Julianne making it to the state finals. We're already late." That was the pattern. Julianne's almosts were always worth more than my first places. Her tragedies were grand operas, mine were minor inconveniences. Her divorce was a family crisis that required me to walk down the aisle alone. My wedding was just a dinner we had to get through. I looked at the blue ribbon that day and realized that in the Vance house, you didn't get points for growing things. You only got points for being the loudest person in the room. And as I prepared for my wedding, I realized Julianne was still screaming, and my father was still covering his ears to everything else. The final confirmation that I was a ghost in my own family came on the night of my high school graduation. It should have been my night, but in the Vance household, the calendar always belonged to Julianne. That same week, she had received her acceptance letter for a prestigious MBA program. My parents, in their infinite wisdom, decided to combine my graduation party with her acceptance celebration. We went to a steakhouse downtown where the napkins were made of heavy linen and the wine list was the size of a novel. 3 speeches were given that night. All 3 were about Julianne. My father toasted her visionary leadership. My mother cried over her limitless potential. Julianne thanked them for always prioritizing her dreams. I sat at the end of the table, wearing my graduation gown cord, and clapped in all the right places. No one mentioned that I had graduated in the top 5% of my class or that I'd been accepted into one of the best landscape architecture programs in the country. When I finally brought it up, my mother had set her wine glass down with a soft clink. "Gardening, Elara. We really need to think about how we phrase that to the neighbors. It sounds so vocational." I had paid for my own application fees with money I earned mowing lawns. I had a 3.7 GPA. But to them, I was just a girl who liked playing in the mud. By the time I met Caleb, I had learned to build my own walls. Caleb was a structural engineer. A man who understood that a foundation is the only thing that keeps a house from falling. He saw the dirt under my nails and didn't see a vocational hobby. He saw a career, a passion, and a woman who knew how to make things grow in rocky soil. But as the wedding approached, I made the mistake of thinking, just for a second, that maybe the golden child dynamic had faded with age. I invited them. I designed the invitations myself, pressing wildflowers into the paper. I asked Arthur to walk me. He said yes. I should have known that a yes from Arthur Vance is always subject to a veto from Julianne. 2 days after the 6-word phone call, I found myself sitting on my porch, staring at the hydrangea bushes I had planted when I bought this house. I was holding a yellowed envelope that had been tucked away in my safe for years. It had been given to me by Mrs. Gable, our old neighbor and my grandmother Eleanor's closest friend. Eleanor had died 11 years ago, but she had left a package with Mrs. Gable with a very specific instruction: give this to Elara only when she is about to become a wife. I hadn't opened it until now. I felt like I needed a voice from the past to drown out the silence of the present. The letter inside was short. My grandmother had been a woman of few words and a very sharp shovel. Elara, it began. By the time you read this, you will be standing at a crossroads. I know the family you were born into. I know how they look at you, and I know how they look at Julianne. They see the bloom, but they never see the roots. Do not wait for them to give you permission to be happy. They will never give it, because your light makes them realize how dark their own rooms are. Find the people who show up. Not the ones who are required to be there, but the ones who choose to be. Your real family isn't in your blood, Elara. It's in the dirt under your nails and the people who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty with you. I folded the letter. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak in my yard. My real family. I looked at my phone. I didn't call my mother back. I didn't call Arthur. Instead, I scrolled past their names until I reached the D section. I called Silas Delaney. Caleb's father. A man who had spent 40 years in a welding mask, building bridges that other people took for granted. A man who had never missed a Sunday dinner since Caleb and I started dating. The phone rang twice. Hey, kiddo, Silas's gravelly voice came through the line. Caleb said you were finishing the flowers. You need me to come over and move those heavy planters? I took a breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Silas, I said, my voice trembling for the first time. I need to ask you something. And it's much heavier than a planter. I told him everything. The phone call. Julianne. The empowerment of walking alone. The silence on the other end was heavy, but it wasn't the cold silence of my father. It was the silence of a man measuring a cut. Elara, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. I've been watching that family of yours for 3 years. I've seen the way you look at them, hoping for a crumb. And I've seen the way they look past you. He paused, and I could hear the strike of a lighter in the background. I have a suit, he said. It's charcoal. Caleb made me get it for the wedding. I've been practicing the tie knot every night because I didn't want to look like a bum in your photos. Silas, you don't have to. I'm going to stop you right there, he interrupted. I never had a daughter. I just had Caleb. But the first time you walked into my workshop and asked me why I used a specific weld on that bridge model, I knew you were mine. So, you tell me. When do you need me at the barn? I closed my eyes, a single tear finally escaping. Saturday. Noon. I'll be there at 11, he said. And Elara? Wear the comfortable shoes. We've got a lot of ground to cover. I hung up, feeling a strange, cold clarity. The plan was set. But as I walked back into my studio, I saw a notification on my laptop. A private investigator I had hired months ago, partly out of professional curiosity for a land deal, partly out of a gut feeling, had just sent over a final report on Julianne's separation. I clicked the file. My breath hitched. The reason Julianne didn't want my father walking me down the aisle wasn't just because she was sad about her marriage. It was because her marriage wasn't just falling apart. It was a crime scene, and she was terrified that if my wedding went off perfectly, the spotlight would finally stay on me long enough for people to start asking where her husband, and his investment money, had actually gone. I stood in the center of Silas Delaney's workshop, the scent of ozone and burnt steel acting as a sensory anchor against the storm in my head. This place was the antithesis of my parents' living room. There were no white linens here, no fragile porcelain, no voices lowered to a whisper to hide the rot behind the walls. Here, everything was heavy, honest, and built to withstand a lifetime of pressure. Silas stood by a lathe, wiping grease from his calloused palms with a rag that had seen better decades. He didn't look at me with the pity my mother used or the annoyance my father projected. He looked at me like a structural engineer looks at a load-bearing beam. Calculating the stress, measuring the strength. "You're shaking, kiddo," he said, his voice a low rumble that felt more like home than any house in Ridgewood. I didn't try to hide it. I told him about the phone call, the 6 words that had severed 24 years of desperate hope. I told him how my father had traded my wedding day for a seat next to Julianne, a woman who had spent her life weaponizing her own fragile ego. Silas didn't interrupt. He didn't offer a platitude or tell me that family is complicated. He just leaned against a workbench covered in blueprints and listened. When I finally ran out of words, the only sound was the hum of a ventilation fan and the distant rhythmic clink of a wind chime outside. "My old man used to say that some people are like pine," Silas said, stepping toward me. "They look good on the outside, they grow fast, but they're soft. You put too much weight on them, and they snap. Then you've got people like oak. They take time. They get scarred. But they don't break. Your father is a pine man, Elara. He spent his whole life trying to look like part of a forest he doesn't belong in." He walked over to a corner of the shop where a charcoal suit hung in a plastic garment bag, looking entirely out of place among the welding masks and power tools. He touched the sleeve with a hand that had spent 40 years shaping the skyline of this state. "I've been practicing the Windsor knot," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his eyes. "Caleb told me I'd look like a fool if I went with a clip-on. I didn't want to overstep, Elara. I know who I am. I'm the guy with the grease under his nails. I'm not the guy who belongs at the head of a Ridgewood table. But if you're asking, if you're telling me you need a man who won't flinch when the doors open, then I'm your man." The relief that washed over me was so violent I nearly lost my footing. It wasn't just about the walk down the aisle. It was the realization that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one doing the supporting. I was being held up by a man who wasn't required to love me by blood, but who chose to do it by merit. "Saturday," I whispered. "Noon." 11, Silas corrected, his voice firm. "We're going to walk that aisle like we built the floor ourselves. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when you stop trying to hold up a house that doesn't want to stand." I left the workshop that night feeling lighter, but the weight of Julianne's secret still burned in my pocket. The PI report was a ticking clock. Julianne wasn't just sad. She was desperate. Her husband, Preston, hadn't just left, he had disappeared 3 days after a federal inquiry began into his boutique investment firm. The rough patch my father was so keen to protect was actually a collapse of global proportions, and the Vance family was standing on the fault line without even knowing the ground was about to open up. The math of the Vance family was always simple: Julianne's needs multiplied by my parents' fear equaled my exclusion. It was a formula that had been perfected over decades. By Thursday, 48 hours before the ceremony, the modern solution my mother had pitched was being treated as a settled law. They didn't call to ask if I had found someone else. They didn't call to see if I was okay. They called to ensure that narrative was maintained. "Elara, honey," my mother said when she finally reached me on Thursday afternoon. "We've spoken to Julianne. She's agreed to attend, but she's very fragile. We've arranged for a private room at the venue so she doesn't have to mingle with the guests before the ceremony. It's for the best. We don't want any outbursts." "Outbursts from who, Mom? Me or her?" "Don't be difficult," she sighed. "This is a very delicate situation. Julianne's husband is away on business, and the rumors are already swirling. We need to present a united front. Your father and I will sit with her in the back until the very last moment. Then we'll take our seats. Since you're walking solo, it actually makes the transition much smoother. No one has to see us separated. It was a masterclass in emotional accounting. My wedding was being treated as a strategic deployment, a way to shield the golden child from the consequences of her own crumbling life. They weren't coming to see me get married, they were coming to use my wedding as a fortress. Is Dad there? I asked. He's in the den, dear. He's had a stressful week. He just needs peace. Peace, I repeated. Right. Tell him I hope he finds it. I hung up and looked at the seating chart for the reception. I had a Sharpie in my hand. With a single, deliberate stroke, I crossed out the name Arthur Vance from the head of the family table. I didn't move him to a different table. I just removed him entirely. In his place, I wrote Silas Delaney. I felt a surge of adrenaline that felt like a fever. For 24 years, I had played the role of the quiet observer, the one who smoothed the edges and filled the gaps so the Vance family could pretend they were perfect. I had been the architect of their comfort, designing my own life around the obstacles they placed in my path. But a landscape architect knows that sometimes, you can't just plant around a dead tree. Sometimes, you have to dig up the roots and start again. I spent the rest of the evening in the barn venue, the space I had transformed with my own hands. I had hung the string lights, draped the cedar beams in jasmine and ivy, and set the copper vases I'd spent months hunting for. It was a masterpiece of vocational gardening. It was a space that breathed life. And as I stood at the end of the long, reclaimed oak aisle, I imagined the look on my mother's face when she realized that the solo walk she had mandated wasn't going to be solo at all. She wanted a modern, empowering walk. I was going to give her a lesson in the power of the people who actually show up. I was going to show her that while she was busy protecting a ghost, I had built a family out of iron and soil. The night before the wedding is supposed to be for rehearsal dinners and toasted champagne, but for the Vances, it was about containment. My parents had refused to attend the dinner Caleb and I hosted at a local bistro. Too much exposure, my mother had whispered. Julianne isn't ready for questions about Preston. So, I ate dinner with the Delaneys. I sat between Caleb and Silas, surrounded by aunts and cousins who spoke loudly, laughed harder, and didn't care about the property value of the town. There were no hidden agendas. No one was scanning the room for exits. Silas stood up to give a toast, his glass held steady in a hand that bore a thin white scar from a beam he'd caught in '98. To Elara, he said, looking straight at me. The woman who knows that a bridge isn't just steel. It's the will to cross over to something better. Welcome to the family, kid. We've been waiting for you. I went to bed that night in the small cottage on the venue property, the silence of the countryside wrapped around me like a shroud. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look for a good luck text from my father that I knew wasn't coming. I slept the deep, heavy sleep of someone who has finally stopped fighting a war they were never going to win. I woke at 5 a.m. The fog was thick over the valley, turning the barn into a ghostly silhouette against the gray sky. I walked out to the garden I'd designed for the ceremony, the dew soaking through my shoes. I found a single white rose that had bloomed late, tucked away near the trellis Caleb had built for me. I clipped it and held it against my cheek. By 10:00 a.m., the venue was buzzing. Jeanette, my maid of honor, was a whirlwind of hairspray and checklists. She knew the situation. She'd been the one to help me coordinate Silas's arrival so that my parents wouldn't see him until the doors swung open. "They're here," Jeanette whispered, slipping into the bridal suite. "The Vance delegation has arrived. Your mom, your dad, and Julianne." They went straight to the private room. They looked like they were walking into a funeral. "Elara. Your sister is wearing a black lace dress that cost more than my car, and she's got sunglasses on inside. It's a whole mood." "Let them stay in the dark," I said, looking at my reflection. I didn't see the gardener my mother mocked. I saw a woman who had built her own foundation. Silas? I asked. He's in the staging area. He's wearing the charcoal suit. Elara, he looks like a king. He's standing there with his back straight, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He told the coordinator that if anyone tries to stop him, he's still got his welding torch in the truck. I laughed, but the sound was cut short by a sharp knock at the door. My heart skipped. I expected it to be a florist or a photographer. Instead, the door pushed open, and my father stepped inside. He looked older than he had on the phone. His suit was perfectly pressed, but he seemed to be shrinking inside it. He looked around the room, avoiding my eyes, his gaze landing on the grandmother's letter I had left on the vanity. Elara, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to see you before it started. You saw me, Arthur, I said, my voice cold. Now you can go back to Julianne. She needs you more than I do, remember? He flinched, his hand gripping the doorframe. It's not that simple. Your mother, she thinks it's the only way to keep the family together. If we don't support Julianne now, she'll lose everything. She already lost everything, Dad, I said, stepping toward him. Preston didn't leave on a business trip. He fled. The feds are looking for him. I know. I've seen the reports. You're protecting a criminal's wife while you throw away your other daughter's wedding. Is that the peace you're looking for? Arthur's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. Before he could respond, the wedding coordinator popped her head in. 5 minutes, Elara. The music is starting. My father looked at me, a desperate, pathetic hope in his eyes. He reached out a hand, perhaps thinking he could still claim the spot he'd vacated. But I didn't move. I didn't offer him a way back. Go sit in the back row, Arthur, I said, pinning the white rose to my bodice. The front row is reserved for people who show up. I walked past him without looking back. I moved toward the barn doors, where the light was streaming in through the cracks. I could hear the string quartet starting the first few notes of the processional. And then, I felt a hand on my arm. It wasn't the soft, manicured hand of Arthur Vance. It was the rough, solid grip of Silas Delaney. Ready, kiddo? He asked. I looked at him, then at the heavy wooden doors that stood between me and my future. Let's go show them how to build a bridge, I said. The doors swung open. The light was blinding. But as my eyes adjusted, I didn't look at the guests. I didn't look at my mother's shocked face in the third row. I looked straight at Julianne, who had pushed her sunglasses up onto her head. Her face wasn't sad. It was twisted in a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage, and she was holding a phone to her ear, nodding as if she were giving an order. The 60-foot aisle of reclaimed oak felt like a runway suspended over a canyon. Every step Silas and I took resonated through the barn, a rhythmic thud that sounded like a drumbeat in a war movie. The string quartet was playing something light and airy, but the atmosphere in the room was heavy enough to choke. I felt the collective intake of breath from 200 people as they realized the man in the charcoal suit wasn't Arthur Vance. The gasps were soft, like the rustle of dry leaves, but to me, they were deafening. I kept my eyes locked on Caleb at the end of the aisle. He was my North Star, the only thing keeping me from spinning off into the orbit of my family's chaos. But even as I focused on him, I could feel the heat of the back row. I didn't have to look to know where they were. Far right. The shadows. My mother, Miriam, would be sitting so rigidly she'd look like she was carved from ice. My father would be staring at the floor, finally realizing that modern empowerment looks a lot like a public execution of his authority. And then there was Julianne. The PI report had mentioned the letter my grandmother left, but it hadn't prepared me for the golden child's final move. As Silas and I passed the 10th row, I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Julianne didn't look like a woman in mourning for her marriage. She looked like a predator that had finally been cornered. She was still holding that phone, her knuckles white, her lips moving in a frantic, silent script. She wasn't watching me walk, she was watching the entrance behind us. "Steady, kiddo," Silas murmured, his forearm as solid as a structural pillar beneath my hand. "Don't give M the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. We're almost to the bridge." We reached the front row. Silas didn't just hand me over. He stopped, looked Caleb in the eye, and gave a nod that carried more weight than any legal document. Then, he turned to the seat I'd labeled with his name, the seat that sat center aisle, front row, the seat that was supposed to be the throne of the father of the bride. He sat down, and the message was sent. The Vance lineage had been bypassed. The foundation had been replaced. I stepped onto the altar, the smell of the jasmine I'd grown myself filling my lungs. Caleb took my hands, his fingers warm and steady. But as the officiant began the opening remarks, a movement in the back of the barn caught my attention. The heavy barn doors, which were supposed to remain closed until the ceremony ended, creaked open just an inch. Two men in dark windbreakers stood in the sliver of light, their eyes scanning the pews. They weren't wedding guests. They had the hard, clinical look of people who were there to serve papers, or worse. Julianne saw them too. She didn't look scared. She looked triumphant. She tucked the phone into her bag and sat back, a terrifyingly sharp smile spreading across her face. The neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had been the keeper of my grandmother's secrets for over a decade, but there was one thing she hadn't mentioned until the morning of the rehearsal. She'd pulled me aside near the hydrangea bushes, her voice a dry whisper that barely cleared the wind. "Your grandmother Eleanor knew the soil in that house was poisoned long before you did, Elara. She knew Julianne wasn't just the favorite, she was the shield. Your parents poured everything into her because they couldn't face the fact that their own lives were empty. But shields break, honey. And when they do, the people behind them get hit with all the debris." I thought about those words as the officiant spoke about the sanctity of choice. I looked at my mother in the third row. Miriam was staring at Silas Delaney's back with a look of pure, concentrated venom. To her, Silas wasn't a savior, he was a glitch in the perfect matrix she had spent 30 years maintaining. He was vocational. He was greasy. He was the physical manifestation of her failure to control me. But then there was the letter. Tucked into my bodice, resting right against my heart, was the 12-sentence manifesto Eleanor had written. "The people who show up are your real family," it said. Every time I breathed, the paper crinkled, a reminder that I was protected by a ghost who had more spine than the living man sitting 3 rows behind her. Eleanor had seen it coming. She had seen the way my father, Arthur, would shrink into the background whenever Julianne raised her voice. She had seen the way the greenhouse incident wasn't just a missed award, but a dress rehearsal for this very moment. My father hadn't missed my award because he was busy. He'd missed it because Julianne had demanded his presence as a sacrifice. It was a test of loyalty he'd been failing for 20 years. The officiant reached the part of the ceremony where she asked if anyone had cause why this union should not proceed. It's usually a formal pause, a breath taken before the vows. But this time, the silence was jagged. I heard the scuff of a shoe in the back row. I heard Julianne stand up. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She simply leaned over and whispered something into my father's ear, a final injection of poison. Arthur's face went from pale to a ghastly, translucent gray. He looked up at me, then at Caleb, and for a second, I saw the man he could have been, the man who would have stood up and told her to sit down. But the shadow of the golden child was too long. He slumped back into the pew, a broken man, while Julianne stepped out into the aisle, her black lace dress swishing against the oak planks. She started walking toward the altar, not as a sister, but as an executioner. The "when do you need me" moment with Silas had been the turning point, the day I stopped being a victim of my birth and became an architect of my life. But as Julianne approached the altar, I realized that the Vance family wasn't going to let me cross the bridge without trying to pull the cables down. "Elara," Julianne said, her voice projecting with the practiced clarity of a litigator. "I think there's something the groom's family needs to know before we proceed. Since we're all about honesty today." The string quartet stopped. The 200 guests shifted in their seats, a wave of awkward murmuring rising like a tide. Caleb's grip on my hands tightened. Silas started to stand, his face darkening, but I caught his eye and shook my head. Not yet. Julianne, sit down, I said, my voice steady, honed by years of dealing with clients who thought they could bully me on a job site. Oh, I'll sit down, she sneered, stopping just 5 feet from the altar. But only after I mentioned that this beautiful barn and Elara's flourishing business were built on a lie. Tell them, Elara. Tell them about the loan you took from Grandma Eleanor's estate. The one that was supposed to be split between us. The one you forgot to mention while you were playing the role of the self-made martyr. A collective gasp hit the room. My mother leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a terrible realization. This was the move. This was how they would reclaim the narrative. If they could brand me a thief, my independence wasn't a victory, it was a crime. There was no loan, Julianne, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous level. There was a trust. One Eleanor set up specifically because she knew you and Preston would do exactly what you've done, bleed the family dry to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford. Julianne laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Prove it. Because the way I see it, the records are missing. Just like Preston. She turned to the room, playing to the gallery, the debate captain in her element. My sister wants you to think she's the one who shows up. But she's just the one who knows how to hide the paperwork. Isn't that right, Dad? Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. But Julianne didn't need him to. She looked back at me, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. And speaking of missing things, those men in the back. They aren't here for me, Elara. They're here for the owner of this venue. They're here because the landscape architect of the year is being served for embezzlement. The room went into an uproar. Caleb looked at me, confusion and a flicker of fear in his eyes. I looked past Julianne, toward the 2 men in the dark windbreakers who were now walking down the aisle, their faces grim. I reached into the pocket of my wedding dress and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive, the one the PI had delivered that morning. You're right about the embezzlement, Julianne, I said, the suspense in the room reaching a breaking point. But you're wrong about the target. The men aren't here for me. They're here for the person who used my business accounts to launder Preston's missing millions. And they aren't here to serve papers. I looked at the men, then back at my sister, whose face was beginning to crumble as one of the men reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. They're here to make an arrest, I whispered. And they've been listening to this entire conversation through the phone in your bag. The silence that followed my words was not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary, it was the vacuum that precedes a massive implosion. Julianne's hand went instinctively to the designer bag hanging from her shoulder, the one containing the phone that had been her lifeline and was now her anchor. The 2 men in windbreakers didn't stop at the pews. They moved with a synchronized, heavy-treaded efficiency that screamed federal authority. The guests in the back row scrambled to get out of the way, chairs scraping against the oak floor like fingernails on a chalkboard. Julianne's face didn't just lose color, it lost its structure. The sharp, litigious mask she had worn since childhood began to sag, revealing the terrified, hollow girl underneath. She looked back at our father, a desperate plea for a rescue that was never going to come. Arthur Vance sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, a man watching his favorite investment go up in flames in real time. My mother, Miriam, let out a sharp, choked sound, not of grief, but of social horror. Her daughter was about to be handcuffed in a barn, in front of the very people she spent her life trying to impress. Elara, stop this, my mother hissed, standing up and clutching her pearls as if they were a literal shield. Tell these men they're mistaken. You're making a scene. Think of the family. The family died on a Tuesday, Mom, I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. When you and Dad decided that Julianne's secrets were worth more than my dignity. You wanted a united front? Well, here it is. The truth is finally uniting us all. One of the agents stepped into the light of the altar. He didn't look at the flowers or the jasmine. He looked at Julianne. Julianne Vance Hale? I'm Special Agent Miller. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. The clink of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I've ever heard. It was the sound of 24 years of golden child status snapping in half. Julianne didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply collapsed inward, her knees hitting the oak planks I had laid with Caleb. She looked up at me, and for a split second, I saw it, the raw, naked jealousy Jeanette had warned me about. Even now, being led away in iron, she hated that I was the one standing in the light while she was being dragged into the dark. Arthur finally stood up, his legs shaking. There must be a mistake, he whispered, but he didn't move toward her. He didn't offer his arm. He stayed in the safety of his row, a man who had spent his life choosing the path of least resistance, only to find it led to a dead end. As the agents pulled Julianne toward the doors, she turned her head back toward the altar one last time. She didn't look at her parents. She looked at the front row, at the empty seat where our father should have been, and the solid, unyielding presence of Silas Delaney. The father-daughter dance was never meant to be a performance. It was meant to be a transition. But after the barn doors swung shut behind Julianne and the federal agents, the transition felt more like a rebirth. The ceremony had finished in a blur of whispered vows and trembling hands. We were married. The legalities were settled, the rings were on our fingers, but the air in the barn remained thick with the ozone of the arrest. Most weddings have a lull after the ceremony. This one had a fever. As the band transitioned into the reception set, I saw my parents standing by the dessert table. They looked like ghosts haunting their own lives. They weren't talking to anyone. No one was talking to them. The Vance name, once a currency in this town, had devalued to zero in the span of an hour. They stood near the lemon cake I had chosen, the one my mother had called too rustic, and watched as the people who actually showed up for me swirled around them. Then came the moment that changed the gravity of the room. The band leader, a man who had seen enough weddings to recognize a shift in the atmosphere, leaned into the microphone. And now, if you'll all turn your attention to the floor, it's time for the father-daughter dance. The room went silent. You could hear the wind rustling the cornstalks outside. My mother's head snapped up, her eyes darting to Arthur. He took a half step forward, his hand instinctively adjusting his tie, a reflex from a man who still thought he could salvage the narrative. He actually started to walk toward the floor, a small, pathetic smile forming on his lips, a man ready to play the role of the proud father for the sake of the photos. But I didn't look at him. I walked straight to the front row, center aisle, and held out my hand to Silas Delaney. Silas stood up slowly. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at the guests. He looked at me with those steady gray eyes that had seen 40 years of iron and sweat. He took my hand with a grip that was warm and calloused, a hand that had built bookshelves and bridges, a hand that had never once pushed me aside for the sake of a louder voice. The band started to play an acoustic version of a song about finding your way home. As we stepped onto the floor, I saw Arthur freeze in the middle of the room. He was standing in a literal no man's land, caught between the daughter he had abandoned and the wife who was already looking away in shame. He stayed there for 5 seconds, the same 5 seconds I had counted on Tuesday, and then he slowly, quietly, retreated to the corner. Silas didn't dance like a man at a gala. He danced the way he built, measured, focused, and completely present. "You okay, kiddo?" he whispered, his hand on my shoulder. "I'm strong, Elara," I said, using the word he had given me in the bridal suite. "Good," he said, and I felt him squeeze my hand. Because a woman who builds things as beautiful as this barn, she deserves to have a floor that doesn't shake under her feet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother whisper something to Arthur. He flinched, then nodded. They turned together, moving with the synchronized grace of people escaping a crime scene, and slipped out through the side exit. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't leave a gift. They left the way they had lived their lives in relation to me, silently, as if I were a ghost that had finally become too loud to ignore. By 10 p.m., the gossip of the arrest had settled into a low hum, but for me, the night was just beginning to reveal its true architecture. The reception was a triumph not of wealth, but of presence. I looked around the barn at the people who were left. The greenhouse workshop moms were dancing near the band. My accountant, Gloria, was sharing a bottle of wine with Caleb's aunts. Mrs. Gable was sitting in the corner, Eleanor's letter tucked into her purse, looking like a woman who had finally completed a very long, very difficult assignment. I was sitting at the head table, the charcoal suit of Silas Delaney to my left and the structural engineer of my dreams to my right, when Jeanette leaned in. "Elara," she whispered, her eyes wide. "There's someone at the entrance. He won't come in. He says he just needs to give you one thing." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. I stood up, Caleb's hand lingering on my wrist for a second in a silent offer of protection. I walked through the barn, past the string lights and the copper vases, toward the large open doors. Standing in the shadows of the gravel driveway was a man I hadn't seen in years. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a weathered tactical jacket, his face lined with the kind of stress that doesn't come from insurance claims or spelling bees. It was Preston. Julianne's husband. The man the feds were looking for. He didn't move toward me. He stayed in the dark, his hands visible so I could see he wasn't a threat. He looked at the barn, at the lights, and then at the ring on my finger. "I heard about the arrest," he said, his voice a dry, hacking sound. "I was watching from the tree line. I knew she'd try something. She couldn't help herself. She had to be the center of the story, even if the story was an ending." "Preston," I said, my heart pounding. "You need to leave. There are agents everywhere." "I'm already gone, Elara," he said, stepping back into the deeper shadows. "I just wanted you to have the one thing Julianne tried to burn when the feds first knocked on our door. She thought it was just a hobby. She didn't realize it was the only thing in that house that actually had value." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather-bound journal. He tossed it onto the gravel between us. It was my growth journal from the greenhouse incident, the one from when I was 15. The one my father had promised to look at but never did. The one I thought had been thrown away when my mother dismantled my greenhouse to save the property value. "She kept it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "She used it," Preston said, his voice fading as he retreated toward the woods. "She used your soil pH formulas and your light cycle data to build the legal defense for the shell companies. She didn't think you were a gardener, Elara. She thought you were a genius. She was just too terrified to let you know it." I picked up the journal, the leather cool and smooth against my palms. I opened it to the first page, seeing my own 15-year-old handwriting. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw something else. Tucked into the back cover was a fresh, crisp envelope with no return address. I opened it, expecting a confession or a plea for help. Instead, it was a single photograph, taken from a distance, of the Herbina honey labels I had been designing in secret for my new business venture. Across the back of the photo, in a handwriting I didn't recognize, were 4 words that made the world go cold. "You aren't the only one building." I stood under the amber glow of the barn's entrance, the leather-bound journal of my 15-year-old self clutched to my chest like a shield. The 4 words on the back of the photo. "You aren't the only one building," felt like a physical blow. Preston was gone, vanished into the tree line like a ghost returning to the ether, but he had left behind a bomb that was still ticking. I looked back at the warmth of the reception, the laughter of the Delaneys, the safety of the life I had meticulously cultivated. For a second, I wanted to throw the journal into the fire and pretend I hadn't seen the photo. But a landscape architect knows that if you ignore a crack in the foundation, the whole structure eventually comes down on your head. I retreated to the bridal suite, locking the door behind me. I spread the journal open on the vanity. This was the book my mother had claimed was lost during a spring cleaning, the one my father had looked at with glazed eyes. As I flipped through the familiar sketches of heirloom tomatoes and nitrogen charts, I began to see the shadow work. Between my notes on soil pH, Julianne had scrawled intricate flowcharts. They weren't about plants. They were about the movement of capital. She had taken my biological systems, the way nutrients move through roots to sustain a bloom, and translated them into a blueprint for moving illicit funds through dormant accounts. My sister hadn't just ignored my work, she had plagiarized the very logic of my mind to build her house of cards. But it was the photo that kept my pulse at a jagged rhythm. The image of my Herbina honey labels was crisp, taken from a vantage point that could only have been my own studio window. Someone had been watching the birth of my new brand. Someone knew about the elite Rawalpindi and Islamabad markets I was targeting. Someone was tracking the modern Islamic luxury aesthetic I'd been developing in the dark. I felt a presence behind me. I didn't jump. I knew the weight of those footsteps. I looked in the mirror and saw Silas Delaney standing in the doorway. He didn't ask what I was doing. He saw the journal, saw the photo, and saw the color had drained from my face. "The feds took the sister," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "But they didn't take the architect. Did they, kiddo?" "She didn't do this alone, Silas," I whispered, holding up the photo. "Preston just gave me this. Someone is already ahead of me. Someone is building a rival brand using my own proprietary soil data. They aren't just trying to outrun the law, they're trying to bury my business before it even launches." Silas walked over, his heavy hand landing on my shoulder. He looked at the photo, then at the journal. "Your family, they don't just take your time, Elara. They take your light. They saw a woman making something from nothing, and they decided to treat you like a quarry. They wanted to strip mine your brain and leave you with a hole in the ground." "I thought I was free," I said, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. "I thought the arrest was the end of the story." "In construction, the demo is the easy part," Silas said, turning me around to face him. "The hard part is the rebuild. You've got the blueprints. You've got the iron. And you've got me. If they want a war of architecture, we'll give them one. But first, you need to realize that the person who took that photo wasn't Julianne. She's been in a panic for weeks." I looked at the photo again. The angle. The height. It was too high for a person standing on the ground. It was taken from the balcony of the main house. The room where my father, Arthur, spent his afternoons, resting, because he was too stressed to face the world. The realization hit me like a cold front. My father wasn't just a weak man following a strong wife. He was the silent partner. He was the one who understood the vocational value of my work better than anyone, and while he was missing my awards and forgetting my graduation, he was meticulously documenting every innovation I made to keep the Vance estate solvent. He wasn't the victim of Julianne's drama, he was the curator of it. The final hour of the wedding felt like a slow-motion descent into a new reality. I didn't confront Arthur. I didn't make a scene. I walked back onto that dance floor and I performed the role of the happy bride, but inside, I was already calculating the countermove. I looked at the guests, the moms from my workshop, the clients who trusted me, and I realized they weren't just guests. They were my scouts. They were my network. As the string lights began to flicker and the band packed away their instruments, I found myself standing alone by the altar I had built. The jasmine was still fragrant, but the air was turning sharp with the coming winter. I pulled the white rose from my bodice and laid it on the wooden trellis Caleb had built. "It's done," Caleb said, stepping up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. "They're gone, Elara. The police, the feds, your parents, the barn is finally empty." "It's not empty, Caleb," I said, leaning back into him. "It's cleared. There's a difference." I told him about the journal. I told him about Arthur's balcony and the Herbina labels. I told him that my father wasn't just a man who chose the path of least resistance, he was the one who had paved the path with my own stolen bricks. Caleb didn't flinch. He was a structural engineer, He knew that when you find a termite infestation in the main support, you don't patch the wood. You replace it with steel. So, what's the move? He asked. We don't wait for the lawsuit, I said, my voice hardening. We launch. Tonight. Every contract I've secured, every soil patent I've filed, we move them into the Delaney Holding Company. We let Arthur and the remnants of the Vance estate sue a ghost. By the time they realize the assets are gone, I'll have already broken ground on the hospital wing. My work won't be a hobby anymore. It'll be a monument. I looked at the oak aisle one last time. 60 feet of reclaimed wood that had seen an arrest, a betrayal, and a rebirth. I thought about the man in the charcoal suit who had walked me down that aisle. Silas hadn't just given me away, he had guarded the transition. Monday morning would come. The headlines in Ridgewood would be brutal. Socialite arrested at sister's barn wedding. Vance family investment scandal. My mother would likely never show her face at the club again. My father would retreat into his den, surrounded by the ghosts of the daughter he tried to harvest. But as I walked out of that barn, hand in hand with a man who loved the dirt under my nails, I realized that the emotional peak of the night wasn't the arrest or the dance. It was the moment I realized that my value wasn't something they could take. It was something I grew. And unlike the Vance family, my roots went deep enough to survive the frost. The drive home was silent, the kind of silence that exists between two people who have just survived a landslide. We reached the small cottage, the one we'd stay in before leaving for our honeymoon, a trip to the botanical gardens of Kyoto, a place where every stone and leaf has a purpose. I sat at the small wooden table, the journal open before me. I took a pen, not a drafting pencil, but a heavy, ink-filled pen, and I wrote on the very last page. To Arthur and Miriam, you spent 30 years trying to prune me into a shape that fit your garden. You failed to realize that I am not a hedge. I am a forest. You can take the fruit, you can take the shade, but you will never take the soil. The Herbina brand is mine. The hospital contract is mine. And the man who walked me down the aisle? He's the father you were too afraid to be. I didn't mail it. I didn't need to. I took a photo of the page and sent it to the family group chat, the one that had been silent since Tuesday. Then, I blocked every single one of them. I looked out the window at the garden I'd planted 4 years ago. The lavender was holding. The dogwood was tall. The moon was high and silver, casting a glow over the land that made everything look like a blueprint for a better world. The big reveal of my life wasn't that my family was toxic. I'd known that since the greenhouse incident. The reveal was that I didn't need their apology to be whole. I didn't need Arthur to see the blue ribbon to know I'd won. I didn't need Julianne to be sad for my happiness to be real. I picked up the phone one last time and called Jeanette. It's me, I said. The modern Islamic luxury launch? We move the date up. We go live at midnight. And Jeanette? Tell the colorist in Darien that the next time she sees Julianne, she can tell her that black lace was a bold choice. It's a shame it's the only thing she has left that's authentic. I hung up and felt the weight of the week lift, replaced by the heavy, satisfying gravity of a new build. I was Elara Vance Delaney. I was a landscape architect, a business owner, and a woman who had finally stopped waiting for the rain. I walked into the bedroom where Caleb was waiting. The world outside was cold, but the foundation was solid. I had built a greenhouse at 14 that grew tomatoes for people who didn't care. Now, I was building a life that grew healing for people who did. As I turned out the light, I thought about the letters carved into the oak bookshelf back in my shop. What mattered was the work. What mattered was the showing up. The doors had opened. The aisle was behind me. And as I closed my eyes, I knew one thing for certain. The people who show up are your real family. And for the first time in 32 years, I was finally home.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.